Discord over illegal immigration intensifies. The White House disparages GOP governors who are sending illegal immigrants to Democratic cities. NTD's Iris Tao has more on how Republicans are responding.
Republicans stepping up their protest of the Biden administration's border policies. This week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis sent dozens of illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott sent hundreds to Washington, D.C. And these actions are triggering condemnation from Democrats in the Biden administration, which are accusing Republican governors of using illegal immigrants for a political stunt.
And we have a process in place to manage migrants at the border. We're working to make sure it's safe and orderly and humane. Republican officials should not interfere with that process by waging these political stunts.
The White House on Friday further accused these governors of using, quote,
tactics we see from smugglers in places like Mexico and Guatemala.
But the Florida governor defends his actions.
We are doing it voluntarily. They sign a release and then they get a packet. What's not humane is what Biden is doing. He's given a false promise. The border is open, luring people to come here, and then basically cutting these people loose and leaving them high and dry.
Meanwhile, White House officials are reportedly discussing litigation options against these GOP governors. I asked Texas Congressman Chip Roy for his take on it.
Or you want to complain about 50 going to Martha's Vineyard when 53 human beings died in a bus in San Antonio, Texas? And the administration wants to sue a governor of a state for wanting to send a signal to the country. And that's what this is about. It's waking the country up.
And on criticism, saying that they're using immigrants as political pawns. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, it's the administration that have been using human beings as political pawns now for many years. And the result are dead migrants and dead Americans.
And Congressman Michael Cloud adds,
our taxpayer dollars has been sending people across the country to different communities for a while. And this administration continues to deny and lie about it.
Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill are calling on the Pentagon to end its vaccine mandate. They're citing grave concerns over the military's readiness. In a letter to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin on Thursday, the lawmakers said the U.S. military currently faces a, quote, self-imposed readiness crisis. They cited data showing that 8% of the Army face expulsion over the vaccine mandate. This is while the Army already struggles with recruiting targets this fiscal year and has to cut its targets for the next fiscal year. Meanwhile, the Marine Corps quietly updated its vaccine policy earlier this week. The branch will not be punishing those seeking religious exemptions, at least for now. This is in response to a recent ruling by a federal judge in Florida. The Chinese regime is sanctioning top executives of 2 U.S. arms firms in retaliation for recently selling arms to Taiwan. The sanctions were imposed on Raytheon Technologies CEO Gregory Hayes and Boeing Defense, Space and Security CEO Theodore Colbert. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning announced the sanctions at a regular briefing. The move came after the State Department approved a potential $1.1 billion sale of military equipment to Taiwan through contracts with Boeing's defense division and Raytheon. Details about the sanctions or how they will be enforced were not provided. The sanctions on the 2 American CEOs are unlikely to have any significant effect. Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin met for the first time since the war began in Ukraine, and the 2 regimes are forging even closer ties amid the war. What should the U.S. take away from this? Here to discuss, we have Professor and former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Robert Destro. Professor Robert Destro, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have just finished a meeting in person. What are some of your biggest concerns of a more fortified Russia-China alliance in terms of regional stability around the world?
Well, I would start to answer your question by starting close to home. There's no question that both President Putin and President Xi are interested in replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And I think I don't think our politicians or the country as a whole has any idea what a world of hurt that will cause here in the United States, wholly apart from the question of regional stability.
There's often a discussion of which regime, Russia or China, poses more of a threat to the United States. What do you think?
Well, I think that's the wrong question. I mean, I think the right question is what does this forthcoming BRICS alliance, which has Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and most of the global South, what does that look like? And that's a bloc that is formidable in its nature, and it will change the power equation across the world in ways that don't help us.
Professor, I'd like to ask you about human rights. You've said before that there are currently 3 genocides taking place inside of China. Tell us about that, and if so, how do you think history will regard any civilized nation really conducting business as usual with this regime?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at history, let me take a concrete example. Actually, you could use 2, but I'll take one, and that is what happened in Rwanda in the 90s. We all knew what was going on in Rwanda. Samantha Power, who's now the administrator of USAID and the chief steward of all our foreign assistance programs, told me personally that it wasn't that we were unaware. We were aware. We just couldn't get the government to agree on what to do about it. And to this day, everybody's embarrassed that we didn't do anything about what went on in Rwanda. We simply stood by and watched it happen. Well, in China, we have a very different situation. We have a situation in which we do business with China. Our companies do business with China. We import goods from China. We've become intensely dependent on China. And so when you say to somebody, well, why don't we just throttle back a little bit and not buy goods that are created by slave labor, which was one of the big issues that I dealt with as assistant secretary. People look at you like you're crazy. Well, what do you mean? We can't stop doing that. We want to turn, turn our country green. To which my response is, no. What you're doing is you're turning the country red with the blood of the people who are being victimized, by what's going on in China.
With the midterm elections coming and a potential shift in the balance of power, the GOP says it will meaningfully hold China accountable. What does this actually look like to you?
Well, as an initial matter, what it looks like is putting teeth in and getting some enforcement of the anti-human trafficking provisions of our import laws. I mean, there's any solar panel, for example, or battery that's made in China is tainted, and we need to accept that. Now, that's not a bad thing in terms of our own domestic production of such goods. We also have to start meaningfully doing the same thing with respect to sanctions. But now the sanctions have to be on Americans who do business with these regimes. I mean, if you look at the way in which Europe and the United States are dealing with Russia with respect to Ukraine, because of the atrocities that are being attributed to President Putin, then, well, what about the atrocities that are being attributed to President Xi and his unified state-private partnership? We need to be consistent in the way we apply economic pressure, and that's what we need to do.
Professor Robert Destro, thank you so much. The days of filling out tons of paperwork and waiting for hours to renew your passport could soon be over. The U.S. State Department says it plans to start taking passport renewal applications online. The move comes after a successful pilot program was launched to help with the pandemic backlog, which had resulted in renewal wait times of up to 18 weeks. However, not everyone will be able to use the new online service. That includes people under the age of 16 and those applying for a passport for the first time. The new online renewal system is expected to launch early next year.